Well, good afternoon. You can always tell the hardcore Little Lecture fans by the ones who come out in a downpour. So thank you all for braving the elements and coming in. No, seriously, thank you all for coming to the McFarland Hubbard House, headquarters of the West Virginia Humanities Council, for the fifth and final talk in our annual Little Lecture series. The 2022 series is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities Initiative, A More Perfect Union. This initiative supports programs that explore issues of civic engagement and civics education as part of a series of programs leading up to the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. With the exception of Denise Giardina's monumental novel Storming Heaven, released in 1987, few works of historical fiction, surprisingly, have been set in the tumultuous world of the West Virginia mine wars. That changed in late 2021 with first-time novelist William Jeffrey Barnes and his novel Mingo, which follows two brothers separated by the 1912 Paint Creek strike who find each other on opposite sides of the Battle of Blair Mountain. No less a journal than the Bluefield Daily Telegraph has praised Mingo as a timeless trip through homespun heroism, heartbreak, and resolution. Born in Tazewell, Virginia, near the border with West Virginia, Jeff Barnes developed a fascination with the Battle of Matewan as a young man, long before he moved to Richmond to practice law. He is married to the former Tamara Counts, an emergency medicine physician who is here with us today. Tamara is also from Southwest Virginia, Lebanon and Russell County, and together they are the parents of two daughters, Carly and Maggie. And delightful to say, the couple just celebrated Carly's marriage a couple of weeks ago in Richmond, so congratulations. Okay. In this little lecture, he'll be discussing the importance of his coal mining family roots, putting himself into 100-year-old shoes, and using fiction as a tool for exploring ideological conflict. And I should also say that copies of the novel are available in the parlor here, courtesy of our friends at Taylor Books. Please welcome the author of Mingo, Jeff Barnes.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the West Virginia Humanities Council for inviting me to be here. It's a real honor. I'm happy that my wife Tamara could be here with me today. We were here last September to join in the centennial celebration of the Battle of Blair Mountain, so it's always fun to be back and to meet new people. I want to thank a couple of people here at the beginning before I start talking about the book, and the first person I want to thank is Sudhakar Jamkandi, who Jamie, as I've gotten to know him, and Jamie reached out to me in January after reading Larry Hype's book review that was published in the Bluefield Daily Telegraph. And Jamie's a professor at Bluefield State College and was interested in Mingo, and Jamie since has written a wonderful review of Mingo that was published in the Broadside, the online journal for the West Virginia Humanities Council, and it was in June's edition. So Jamie, thanks so much for your interest in and support of Mingo. I do appreciate it. I also want to thank my publisher, Joni Albrecht, and the great team at Little Star for all their help, letting me realize Mingo, getting it into publication. And then briefly, I want to thank a couple of my high school teachers, and I don't know of a better forum for recognizing the contributions of teachers than here at the Humanities Council. Like so many people, I was blessed to have great high school teachers, and two in particular I want to recognize, Larry Hypes and Iva Dean. And I want to do it sort of by way of tying it in with the theme of the book, which is helping one another or looking out for one another. The working title of Mingo was actually My Brother's Keeper. The book is replete with instances of characters helping one another and looking out for one another, whether it's Bascom taking in Maud and her family after Sesko's death, or Walker and Grace taking in Durwood as a young boy, or Cap and Hattie trying to help Durwood assimilate to Richmond. And I think it's important because whatever successes we achieve in life are due in no small measure to the help we get from others, particularly when we're young, and I was no different. Larry Hypes, his first teaching job at Tazewell High School was at Tazewell High School in 1975, and he and I immediately bonded, and though we lost track of each other, last fall I reached out to him to ask if he would be interested in reading Mingo and if he thought it worthy to do a review, and he happily agreed, and he did the wonderful review. And then Iva Dean, he describes her as the dean of the English department. She's long since been retired, but still lives in Tazewell. And she was very solicitous of my horrible attempts at writing fiction when I was in high school. And she would grade my papers and give them back to me, and I had read all over them. But I particularly had one edit from her that was all over the papers, and it would say W period, C period, which meant word choice. You know, there was a better word I could have found. So this spring, she read the book, she sent me a letter, and she told me how pleased she was to have been reminded of her youth in Coalwood, West Virginia, in McDowell County. Her father was a coal miner there, and her letter said this, which I was particularly proud of. quote, "I was amazed and so pleased with your word choice throughout the entire book." So I appreciate so much what they did for us. And you all will be interested to know that she is the sister of Frida Jo Riley, who is the teacher that Homer Hickam wrote about in Rocket Boys and who inspired him to become a NASA scientist. So thanks to my high school teachers. And one other person I want to thank who helped so much with my writing and with this book is David Robbins. David is a novelist, a playwright, and a wonderful creative writing instructor, and he lives in Richmond, and he's a good friend. I took a short story class from him about 7 years ago, and it rekindled my desire to write fiction that I'd had since I was in high school but hadn't really thought much about. These people, again, I want to thank for all their help to me in getting Mingo in print. What I thought I'd do today is tell you a little bit about how I came to this story, touch a little bit on the book's themes, maybe along the way share some Mime Wars history, though word of caution, I'm not an historian, and I had a chance to speak with some of you before we started, and I guarantee that there are people here who know more about the Mime Wars than I'll ever know. I learned a lot and tried very hard not to cram every fact that I learned into the book. One of the things I learned in writing fiction and marrying fiction with history was sometimes you have to bend facts a little bit in service of the story, and I did that with the use of scatter tags, which I learned from the Mime Wars Museum in Matewan, that the scatter tags really weren't used until the 30s to the 60s. Well, of course, they appear in my book in 1908 because I needed them to show Durwood trying to find a scatter tag for the mine where his brother and father worked to show that he wanted to renew that connection or keep that connection strong. So you may have noticed other instances where the facts aren't exactly right, and I will apologize if you've done that, but in some cases it was intentional. And then finally, I want to reflect on this idea of two sides of a pancake in today's America. For those of you who haven't read Mingo, just very quickly, it's a fictional story about brothers who grow up in Mingo County, West Virginia. They get separated in 1908 upon the death of their mother, and the younger brother, Durwood, gets sent to Richmond to live with their mother's favorite cousin, Grace, and her husband, Walker, who was a well-heeled, wealthy lawyer working for the railroad, while Bascom stayed behind and working in the coal mines along with his father, who's descending into alcoholism. As Durwood grows up in affluence on Richmond's Monument Avenue, Bascom continues to toil in the mines, feeling that life is passing him by, suffering at the hands of the oppressive Baldwin Felts agents. And when they meet again on the day of the Battle of Matewan in May of 1920, they find themselves on opposite sides of the Second Coal Mine War and hurtling towards this final confrontation at the Battle of Blair Mountain. And the book explores how time and physical distance and ideological differences can drive a wedge even between the closest of people. How I came to this story was I was born and raised in Tazewell, Virginia, and there's someone, happy to say, someone here from Tazewell. Tazewell is here. It's 19 miles south of Bluefield, West Virginia, southwest of Bluefield, West Virginia. And in many ways, I had a stronger connection to West Virginia as a kid than Virginia because we got the Bluefield Daily Telegraph. And so as a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s, I read all about southern West Virginia sports. So, the mighty Bluefield Beaver football team coached by Merrill Gaynor and then John Schmara, the incomparable North Fork Blue Demons basketball teams of the 70s that won 8 straight state championships. So I was vested in West Virginia sports particularly, but to go to a fast food restaurant or a movie theater or a department store, we had to go to Bluefield. My father had a strong connection too. He grew up in Pocahontas, Virginia, which is right on the Virginia-West Virginia border. And he was born in May of 1919, the year before the Battle of Matewan occurred. I think I remember this, that my father told me that his father tended draft mules in the mines there in Pocahontas. Of course, the mines had played out by 1920 when my father was born, but his father in probably the 1880s, 1890s, possibly tended draft mules. And I love this picture particularly because of the expression on the boy in the middle who looks like he's just seen a ghost. I was intrigued by my father's experience growing up in Pocahontas, Virginia, because so many of his friends were first-generation Americans of Italian and Hungarian descent, whose families, like the Peduzzis in the novel, had come to America looking for a better way of life for them and their families. And he had told me stories about his friends' parents didn't speak English or didn't speak it that well in some cases, and this just fascinated me. And then as a young man, I saw John Sayles' 1987 movie Matewan, which again reminded me of this story, and I had been fascinated with the shootout as a kid, and it fascinated me that a shootout could occur involving dozens of coal miners, 11 Baldwin Felts agents in broad daylight on the main street of a town that's not that dissimilar from the one my father grew up in his lifetime. And so how did that happen? I was just fascinated by it. And so when I saw John Sayles' movie in the late 80s, I began to understand more about it, but I still didn't know very much. And the last piece of why I wrote this story was I've always been intrigued by brothers who ended up on opposite sides of particularly the Civil War. We grew up hearing blood is thicker than water, and if that's true, then how do brothers end up on opposite sides of the Civil War? And so in the spring or winter of 2017, I was working with a writing group, and we were all working on novels. And I decided I wanted to write a novel that had brothers on opposite sides of this Matewan shootout and figure out how they got there and how did it resolve. So I began doing the research and read a number of books and watched documentaries. And what I discovered in the process was this just fascinating but seemingly to me overlooked story about the mine wars. I mean, the bones of a great story I felt were there. These great characters like Mother Jones. And this is a picture of her in 1913. If you look at her and she looks grandmotherly and might bake a pie for you, looks pretty harmless. But you'd be mistaken if you thought that, because she was quite the passionate firebrand in support of the Union members. She was, it seems to me, their patron saint, if you will. She was dubbed the most dangerous woman in America, and these next two slides, I think, will illustrate why. Here she is at a rally in Eskdale, and I guess she's up there on the church steps, and all these people are gathered around her. And it's interesting to note that in the 12 election, Eskdale elected a straight socialist ticket. Same year that Eugene Debs got 1 million votes when he ran for president of the United States. This next picture is my favorite of hers. And you see her here, fist raised or maybe hand raised. I mean, she is exhorting these miners, presumably, and to stand up for their rights and to join the Union. There's a scene in the book where Bascom asks his father, who had met her in 1902, what was she like? And he said, she looks like a schoolmarm, cusses like a sailor. He said, but after hearing her speak, everybody stood up straighter. So she had a very powerful influence and was revered by the miners and reviled by the operators. Sid Hadfield's another one of the characters, again, loved by the miners, reviled by the operators because of his role in the Battle of Matewan. The press loved him. They dubbed him Two-Gun Sid and Smiling Sid. And then there were, of course, other great characters like Sheriff Don Chafin, the Czar of Logan County, and Tom Felts, the owner of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. And in addition to those great characters, found just these wonderful real-life events that Ripley couldn't believe. I mean, the February 7th, 1913 Holly Grove tent camp shoot-up involving the Bull Moose Special. I mean, it's hard to imagine that happened, that an armed train rode through a Union tent camp and shot it up, but it happened. The August 1921 murder of Sid Hadfield and Ed Chambers as they walked up the outdoor steps to the McDowell County Courthouse in Welch. And they were shot by C.L. Lively, who had been an undercover agent for the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. And then, of course, we have the Battle of Blair Mountain, the September 1921 battle, which is the largest armed insurrection in U.S. history after the Civil War. And like so many people I've met since I've written Mingo, I was shocked that I'd never heard of this battle. Throughout my schooling and reading of history, I'd never heard about the Battle of Blair Mountain, when 10,000 miners, dubbed rednecks because of their bandanas that they wore around their necks, tried to get over Blair Mountain into Logan County to liberate their brethren who were languishing in Don Chafin's jails. Of course, they were opposed by about 3,000 state troopers and townspeople and detectives of the Baldwin Felts Agency who were dug in on top of the ridge. So what I realized after doing this research, that there was a great story waiting to be told. I thought one that needed to be told, because these issues of race and class and labor relations that beset America 100 years ago are still roiling us today. And I felt like if I could come up with a couple of compelling characters to weave through this rich seam of historical events and interact with these historical characters, that there might be a novel there and a great way to introduce people to the history of the mine wars. My friend and creative writing instructor, David Robbins, I've heard him say many times, if you want to learn history, read a history text. If you want to understand history, read historical fiction. And to that point, I had a friend of a friend who read Mingo when it was still in a ring binder. It hadn't been published yet. And she sent me an email, and she said something like, if I had encountered the Mine Wars in a history book, my eyes would have glazed over. But in the context of historical fiction, it was accessible, and she was compelled to then go out and actually research the actual facts and do some of her own research. And I've heard that from other people, which I think illustrates the power of fiction to introduce readers to a part of history that they might not otherwise know about or might have overlooked. What I want to do now is just talk a few minutes about a couple of the themes in Mingo, one being the idea of race, and as Lee Smith put it, the differences in how race was handled in the mountain culture versus the highfalutin culture of Richmond in the Old South. And several examples, both Derwent and Bascom, when they arrive in Richmond, try to refer to Hattie, who is the black domestic worker in Grace and Walker's home, as ma'am. And she tells them not to do that. And Bascom in particular has trouble with it, and he wants to know why. And she goes, just trust me, it's better if you don't. I'll know you're thinking it even if you're not saying it. And his comment to her was, well, where I come from, manners is manners. And he thought that she deserved that respect that came along with that title. Another instance where Bascom is getting ready to go to a celebration honoring Robert E. Lee, and he's going with Walker and Grace and Durwood, and before they're leaving, he's in the kitchen talking to Hattie, and Bascom's confused because he doesn't understand why there's so much fuss over somebody who's A, dead, and B, General Hood lost the Civil War. And he's asking her about it, and she says, well, what you'll come to understand is Robert E. Lee is the most beloved figure, in Richmond. And he said, how does that make you feel? And she said, well, I keep my feelings to myself. Again, showing the racial divide that existed certainly in Richmond at the time. For me, the most poignant scene was at the event honoring Robert E. Lee. Bascom sees a black gentleman struggling under the weight of some boxes, and he rushes over to help him. And the next day, Belle, who becomes his girlfriend, asks him why he did that. And he said, what do you mean? She goes, well, he was black. And he goes, well, I may have lots of flaws, but poor eyesight isn't one of them. It seemed to me he could use a hand, so I lent a hand. And she said, well, if you haven't noticed, most people wouldn't do that in Richmond. The first thing they notice is race. And he said, well, what you have to understand is where I'm from, in the coal mines, I work with blacks and whites and Italians and Hungarians, and down in the pit, you can't tell the color of a man's skin. All you care about is whether you can count on the man next to you. And so while I can't claim, again, to be an historian and have researched this tremendously, my readings and my sense of things were that race was handled differently in the southern West Virginia coal fields, which is not to say that there wasn't racism. Of course there was, and schools were segregated, certainly in most of the camps. But I heard this spring an interview that Kinsey Walker, who's the executive director of the Mine Wars Museum, did with a gentleman named Steve Fullen. And Steve's a lifelong resident of Matewan. He's been on the town council there. And he's the grandson of John and Mary Brown, and they're characters, real-life characters that I had encountered during my research. And they were a black couple who moved to Matewan around 1908, and they were the first minority couple to own a dry cleaning business in West Virginia. And what Steve said was that his experience growing up in Matewan, that he didn't experience the type of racism that existed elsewhere, and that his grandparents had said the same thing. Again, not to say that there wasn't racism, but it seemed to be less than say, in Richmond. So that was one of the things the book tried to do. And then, of course, we have the theme of labor relations, labor versus management. If we go back to the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there was this effort to unionize Mingo, Logan, and McDowell counties, the 3 southernmost counties in West Virginia, and the last to unionize, pretty much in all of the coal fields, not just West Virginia. As you might imagine, the coal operators were determined not to let that happen because they were convinced that if they had to pay union wages and union benefits, that they would lose a competitive advantage. And so they hired hundreds of Baldwin-Felts agents to come in and to try to keep the mines open and the union out. Many people saw it as a political battle, that unions were just a sort of a shill, if you will, for the socialist movement. And you did have people like Mother Jones, who was a socialist, and she was pushing it. So some people, looked at it and I think genuinely were concerned that this was an effort to do away with capitalism and our form of government. I think some people saw it as sort of a convenient boogeyman to try and get public favor on their side against the unions. But at the end of the day, as Bascom says in the book, I think for most of the miners, it was a bread and butter issue. I think they wanted to be paid a fair wage for an honest day's work in a relatively safe environment where they were valued more than the draft mules who hauled the coal out of the mines. His view was, our union is made up of Republicans and Democrats and socialists, and we're going to support whoever supports the union and supports us, or at least doesn't oppose the union. So it seems to me that's how I think most of the rank and file miners saw it. What I'm going to do now is pivot to the title today, The United States of Mingo and Two Sides of a Pancake, and talk about how I see that impacting our society today. And just as I warned you, I'm not an historian. Let me assure you, I'm neither a political scientist nor a social scientist. So what I'm about to tell you is just my own thoughts and musings on this topic, and you can choose to ignore any or all of it. And I'll set this up by, in chapter 45, Durwood has arrived in Matewan. And he arrives on the day of the battle, the shootout, the massacre, as we called it as a kid, and he's there, and he gets caught up in it. He doesn't get shot, of course, but after the gunsmoke clears, Sid Hadfield, who has identified him as having been with the Baldwin Felts agents before the shooting began, is going to arrest him, shoot him, something's going to happen, but Durwood is rescued by this guardian angel, this woman who was on the train that had just arrived as the gunfight ended. And she pretends that he is her husband so as to get him away from Sid Hadfield. And so later that night they're having dinner together. She asks him, he's telling her why he's there in Matewan, and that he had come back to bring the lawless bastards to justice who had killed his friend Jude, the fictional nephew of Tom Felts. With that setup, I'm just going to read a very short part of the book, starting with Irma. These lawless bastards, as you call them, have you stopped to think what's driven them to the point they would engage in a gun battle in the middle of town in broad daylight? Durwood pushed away from the table. All I'm saying is that no matter how thin the pancake is, there's always two sides. Before you debase yourself, or worse, get yourself killed, you might want to figure out what's really going on. First of all, attribution for that statement goes to a former law partner. I wasn't a partner at the time. It was my first law firm out of law school. And John O'Brien was a great litigator, and he went on to be one of the premier mediators in Virginia. And I had many, many mediations with John. And every time it went like this. He would come into my room where I'm seated with my client, and I would tell him how great my case was, and that if this case was going to settle, that the lawyer and the client in the other room were going to have to significantly reduce their demands and make significant concessions, or we weren't going to get the case settled. And he'd let me finish, and then he would say, Jeff, no matter how thin a pancake may be, don't forget it has two sides. And his message to me was clear, that the folks in the other room believed as passionately about their case and the facts of their case as I did, and that it would behoove me to step back and take my blinders off and try to appreciate their side of the case. And in doing that, I would be doing a better job for my client. After all, I can't do a very good job for my client if I'm ignoring the other side of the case. As an aside, back in February, John sent me an email, and he said, quote, I trust the flapjack quote was properly footnoted. And so you all can, if you ever run into him, you can tell him I did. I only used it in every mediation, and he did, every mediation. And then a few weeks later, he sent me a picture, and on the front, he sent me two pictures. But the one picture had on the front him wearing a T-shirt, and there's a stack of pancakes. And then the second picture on the back, every flapjack has two sides, and this was the shirt that his mediation company gave him when he retired. I hope I accomplished this in Mingo by recognizing there are two sides. As Jamie noted in his wonderful review, that it would have been too easy to simply focus on the miners who struggled to make a living at a time that favored the owners. I think anybody who encounters the mine wars history can't help but be moved by their plight, and I was no different. While I wasn't trying to draw any degree of moral equivalency between the coal miners and the operators and the Baldwin Felts folks, my goal was to try to use the power of fiction to explore how someone like Durwood could end up on the opposite side of this conflict from his brother Bascom, a brother that he loved and admired. And after all, both of them were good guys. I mean, they wanted to do the right thing. They were motivated to do the right thing, but they came at it from two different perspectives. And as I see it, we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues, that divided us 100 years ago: race and class and labor relations, and lots more. We have abortion, we have gun rights, we have environmental issues. So in Jamie's review that was published in the Broadside, the last paragraph reads, intentionally or not, Mingo emphasizes that we are too quick to draw battle lines, too intent on segregating each other into categories of poor and rich, socialist and capitalist, worker and boss, hillbilly and elite. By the time the bullets have begun to fly, all of us have lost. That's a powerful statement, and it reminds me of something I heard Steve Fullen say in the interview with Kinsey Walker this past spring. He said that his grandparents, John and Mary Brown, or his grandfather, said something like, never let a single aspect of your character define who you are, not your race, not your gender, not your education. And yet, I think increasingly, we're falling prey to that. We're identifying with people who only share our views, which in turn, I think, leads to ignoring the other side of the pancake, or even worse, refusing to believe that there could be another side of the pancake. Chuck Keeney, in his great book, The Road to Blair Mountain, which I think for me was as remarkable for its beautiful prose as the story he tells about trying the efforts that were made to try and save Blair Mountain, wrote about a 2011 event that Alpha Natural Resources had invited to lunch a number of folks who were involved on the Save Blair Mountain side. As they sat down to lunch, several environmental representatives would not sit down and join them for lunch. And as Chuck writes, as one of them told me, it was beneath me to share a meal with those pigs. And Chuck writes in his book and does a very good job of saying he always worked hard at, and as did his Friends of Blair Mountain colleagues, to separate the message from the messenger and to keep things civil and, again, not personal. And I think it may have in part been responsible for the success they had in protecting Blair Mountain. Another example I ran across of this sort of topic, if you will, was in a Politico article recently, within the last 3 or 4 weeks, called Sotomayor, Thomas, and Supreme Court Friendships. It was by a journalist, I think, who's with the LA Times maybe, but Nicholas Greenberg. And it started off, the Supreme Court's most liberal justice says the court's most conservative justice is kind and thoughtful and a friend. Progressive Twitter was most unimpressed. And the article went on to talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's friendship with Justice Scalia and how, though they were occupied opposite ideological poles, they shared a love of opera and of food and of travel, and they even spent New Year's Eves together. Justice Sotomayor in this article was quoted as saying that, quote, "That's why I can be friends with him," meaning Justice Thomas, "and still continue our daily battle over our difference of opinion in cases." And the remarks on Twitter were swift and critical. One said bunk, another so tone deaf, a third said she was either drunk or smoking marijuana, and a fourth, oh, expletive deleted, gagged me. The author of the Politico article, Nicholas Greenberg, goes on to note that for many Americans on the left and right, this is a time for battle stations, not dates at the opera. Friendships across the aisle and even basic civility towards one's adversaries are often viewed as a kind of betrayal or at least hypocrisy. Efforts on the part of politicians to find common ground are seen by many as consorting with the enemy. Democracy requires cooperation and compromise with one's political opponents. That's almost its definition. It requires a basic, even if grudging, respect for adversaries, and if you can't muster that, then it requires at least an adherence to agreed upon norms. He goes on to say something that really resonated with me, which was, to make democracy function again, it means where possible to recognize the humanity of those we disagree with. Barry Weiss, who has a newsletter called Common Sense, she's another writer and commentator, she had a similar take in an article that was titled The Post-Roe Era Begins. She writes that we know that some common sense readers feel extremely gratified by Dobbs, the decision overturning Roe v. Wade, and we know that others are scared and worried about what other rights might be under threat. One of the things we value most about this community, meaning the common sense, her readers community, is that we have different views about highly divisive subjects. What we share is a commitment to civility, respect, and honest conversation, even, especially in deeply emotional moments like this one. There are those who claim that the time for nonviolence has passed, that desperate times call for desperate measures, that we are in a war, and in a war the normal rule of politics must be suspended. We could not disagree more strongly with this view. And she concludes with, we know that it's chic these days to write off virtues like civility and decency and humility and grace. We believe these things are the only way forward, that the only alternative to violence is persuasion and argument. And so all of this makes me nostalgic for relationships like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, and Justices Scalia and Ginsburg, and Teddy Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, or moments like the one during the 2008 presidential campaign when John McCain rebuked a supporter who claimed his opponent, Barack Obama, was an Arab. McCain took the microphone and said, "No, ma'am. He's a decent family man and citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about. I admire Senator Obama and his accomplishments, and I will respect him." I have to remind myself of this pancake rule every day at work and outside of work, and some days it works better than others, but as these writers have indicated, I don't believe the alternative is an option if we want to move forward. I also don't think it's an option to shout down or shut out of the public square people with whom we might disagree. But so how did we get here? One culprit, I think, or it seems to me, is the increasing polarization of our congressional districts. Swing seat, and this is something I heard on an NPR story, I can't credit it any better than that, but swing seat is defined as one that was won by 5% or less in the previous election. And in 2002, there were 142 swing seats. In 2012, 99. And this coming election, 30 swing seats out of 435. So what this tells me is we're living in increasingly homogeneous districts where thoughtful debate on issues isn't occurring and dissent isn't tolerated, and oftentimes the only meaningful election is the election that occurs in the primaries in those districts. And another way I think we got here, of course, is social media. Despite all of its potential for good, I think it has some drawbacks to it. A couple are, one, the anonymity that it gives us allows us to say things to and about people that we would never say in person. It eliminates that face-to-face filter, if you will, that promotes, I think, civil discourse. And of course, the echo chamber effect that we can choose to listen only to what we choose to believe anyhow, and that's enhanced by the algorithms that the social media companies use. And I've often wondered if good friends, Teddy Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, were alive today and were in the Senate today, whether they would have had such a close, both personal friendship and working relationship as they did 20 years ago. Back then in the 70s and 80s, after a tough day on the Senate floor where they were battling each other, they could retire to a Capitol Hill restaurant and renew their friendship, which I think made it more likely the next day that they would be able to work together on important legislation. Today, what I fear would happen is people like us using our cell phones would snap pictures of them, which then would get posted and seen in real time back in their districts, and the end result being that each of them is going to be accused of consorting with the enemy and get primaried in the next election. If we step back and think about all of this for a moment and reflect on Mingo, Durwood leaves Matewan at 8 years old. He grows up in affluence on Monument Avenue under the tutelage of a very strongly capitalist man, Walker, who he ends up referring to as ultimately his father, and who'd been led to believe that the Unionists were socialists or worse, even communists, a view that was burnished by his time fighting the Bolsheviks during World War I. He finally comes to realize that the truth was far more nuanced than that. And as he began to take Irma's advice, he began to realize and consider the other side of that pancake, which in turn led him to reconcile with his brother and led to an ultimate act of sacrifice. So let me conclude by saying that there are two things I hope readers of Mingo take away from the book. First is this idea of every pancake has two sides and its implications for us in our everyday lives. I was encouraged on Friday before we left in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. There was a great article about a program called the One Small Step Program. It was founded by the same guy, Dave Isay, who founded a program called StoryCorps that you all may have heard of. And what it does is it brings people of different backgrounds and viewpoints together. And it's based on the contact theory, which holds that interpersonal contact can help in reducing prejudices and fostering friendly relationships and cooperation. As founder Dave Isay put it, he began one small step to, quote, fan the flames of decency. And he says our mission is to convince the country it is our patriotic duty to see the humanity in people with whom we disagree. And then the second takeaway, I hope, is that Mingo has nurtured an interest in readers to learn more about the mime wars and its relevance to us today. The last couple of slides are just what's in the acknowledgement of the book, but just some resources that people can turn to if they want to know more about the facts. There was one book that I failed to list here, and it was in part because I didn't know about it at the time I wrote Mingo, but that is Never Justice, Never Peace. It was by Lon Kelly Savage and his daughter, Jenny Savage Ayers, and it's about the 1913 Pink Creek, Cabin Creek conflict. So I'd encourage you to check them out and visit the Mine Wars Museum in Matewan if you haven't. They're doing a great job of promoting and keeping this history alive. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Yes, so, obviously Susco Eastep was a real character who was killed when the Bull Moose Special drove through the camp, and obviously, his family connection to Bascom and Durwood was fiction, as was, Bascom taking in the family and ultimately she.
It's a good story.
Oh, well, thank you. Never let the facts get in the way of a good story, right? I don't know that I do, really. I mean, certainly I knew about, the Aracoma Hotel being the staging point for the folks that Don Chafin had organized to try to prevent the miners from getting over the mountain. And you had Boy Scouts coming, I think, from Bluefield, and, lots of different people pitching in. But I don't know, I didn't really encounter a whole lot about behind-the-scenes stories, if you will, about what was going on. I mean, again, we know that Don Chafin enlisted some biplanes to drop homemade bombs on the miners.
I will give you a little anecdote. My wife's uncle was on the company side.
Right.
And he was a World War I veteran, and he was a clerk in one of the company stores. And they had him go and man a machine gun on Blair Mountain. And he said that he wasn't about to shoot him. And anytime they fired the weapon, it was into the air. Now, obviously, not everyone did that because some people were killed.
Right.
But he, at least for one, wanted nothing to do with shooting fellow West Virginians.
And I suspect there were a lot of people, probably on both sides maybe, who were just as soon not shooting at, be shooting at each other. Well, and like I say, neither a political scientist nor a social scientist, all just my personal feelings, but I mean, I think it has to start on a person-to-person basis, right? I mean, if we're engaging ideas, you're reading about something in the paper and you disagree with, and you're engaging with an idea, chances of you seeing that idea any differently than your preconceived notions are unlikely. But if you take the time to get to know somebody who is advancing that idea, then it doesn't mean that you're going to agree with the idea, but at least, again, it helps you to understand the humanity of the person behind the idea on the other side. But I think it's this one small step program, which is, just trying to do it one step at a time, one person at a time, connecting and taking all this animosity and vitriol out of it and trying to bring it down to a human one-on-one level. For me, again, I'm no expert. Well, my apologies to Bill Blizzard's family, because yes, I did. I mean, I had to give Bascom this sort of role, if you will, of leading it, so that when we get to the very end in the courtroom scene, he's seen as sort of the, he plays this chief role in the battle. But yes, I pretty much. I mean, we know that Bill Blizzard really was the general of that Blair Mountain battle. But I just sort of used Bascom as a proxy to try to make these points. And I mentioned Bill Blizzard, but again, apologies to Bill Blizzard fans and family out there for not giving him more credit. I don't know. I've thought about a prequel, that would go back to when the coal companies and the railroads were coming in and buying up the land, and we'd get to meet Pa and his brother Durwood, maybe the relationship between the Pa and Ma, and sort of explore that. But I also have a lot of letters that my wife knows about. My father's mother was one of 5 sisters, and there was one brother, and these women were tremendous correspondents, and they wrote all these letters. And frequently what they'd do is one of the sisters would get it and append a note and send it on to the next sister. And some of these letters go back to the 1880s. And I haven't really read them yet because I haven't had the time, but I'm hoping there might be a story in some of those letters because they led pretty amazing, fascinating lives, particularly for the time. My mother came from a very traditional family, and she was enthralled by by my father's mother and their aunts because they were very liberated women for the time. I mean, they were loud and they smoked and they swore, and she thought they were just the greatest, most interesting people in the world. So I have a feeling there are a lot of great things in these letters that I'm hoping sort of treasures that I can mine at some point when I get to go ahead to retire from practicing law. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate coming out.